Basically, there's a hairdryer in the toilet. You good? It's cool. Final time. Okay, welcome everyone to, I think this is classed as our summer policy committee meeting that I see in the. So it's very, very hopeful calling it the summer one. But so thanks for coming along. We're small but perfectly formed today. And we're joined with Anna Fowler, who's the new Chief Executive at SCVO. So welcome. Anna's going to say, I put her on the spot and gave her 5 minutes in the agenda, so we'll, 2 minutes. 2 minutes is good, that'll keep us on time. There's a whole pile of apologies, so we'll just note them on the minutes for the next time rather than read everyone's names out. But thank you to everyone who could make it along. Going back over the minutes of the last meeting, did anyone have any points wanted to raise? Nothing? Fantastic. Stephen does such a good job. I don't think there was any outstanding actions, no, yeah, perfect.
I think there was one, I'm not sure if it was in this minute or the previous meeting, where there was a request to have a session, a gender analysis workshop session, which we did last week. So we held that with Angela Hagan facilitating.
And that's recorded, isn't it? It's for people to watch back. Yep. Did anyone attend it? Was it good? Yeah. I was in Canada for somewhere, I don't know. When was it last?
Wednesday.
Last Wednesday, London. But yeah, no, so it's on Basecamp for people to go back and to watch. Good. We'll send that round again after this week just to encourage people to do it. That's grand. So like I said, that was really quick for the easy stuff. So I'm just going to take a little break from the agenda and give Anna a few minutes to introduce herself and how many days in the job were you?
This is day 4.
Day 4. So you can give us a very fresh perspective.
Yeah, as David said, I was here to just kind of observe and take it all in, but I'm now speaking, and which is religious as well, because I'm not very good at not speaking. So I'm Anna Fowler, day 4 as Chief Executive SCVO. What I've spent the last 3 days doing is meeting people, basically. So I've been in the 2 Edinburgh offices and here and in Edward House meeting colleagues. I'm just basically finding out everything that's going on. So I'm still in that kind of slightly startled phase where I'm kind of going, oh, okay, there's that as well. And sort of formulating, I suppose, what my impression, sort of triangulating, I suppose, external impressions with internal impressions, which is obviously a completely different perspective. And this is obviously a really interesting forum for me because this is the first time in this role where I'm getting to actually meet people from the sector who are engaged with SCVO. So that's really useful for me, and I will, despite my tendencies to witter, I will absolutely be in listening mode and sponge mode for the first wee while before I come up with anything really sensible. I don't know if I don't want to kind of do my background's this, my background's that, blah blah blah. But basically, why I wanted the job is because I really think that SCVO and the third sector as a whole is really absolutely fundamental to where we're going in Scotland at the moment, and I think it's a really exciting time to be looking at all of this. You can tell by the things that we're discussing, this is a really exciting time to change how civil society really works, and I really want to be part of that, I suppose, and to have a voice on behalf of a sector that I really, really believe in and really care about. So I'm not going to say any more than that.
Thank you very much.
I'm happy to answer any questions you have at all about anything at any time.
So I suppose that probably should have done it before, but it would be quite helpful for you for us to run around the room who everyone is and who they're. So I'm David McColgan, work for the British Heart Foundation, and from rescind was elected chair at the last meeting, so this is only meeting number 2.
Fraser Solomon from the Humanist Society.
I'm Heather Allen from Church of Scotland.
Jim Dorman from St Andrew's First Aid.
Emily Diva from Music Scotland.
I'm Mona Vickford from Cancer Research UK, although actually I should say that I'm going to comment in a couple of weeks' time to Scottish Government.
Bogie from SCVO.
Ruth Boyle, SCVO.
For chair is
One dollar also installed.
Perfect. Before we move into kind of the main thrust of the meeting, I just want to take a few minutes to update everyone on the conversation I've been having with members of the policy committee. So that at the last meeting, at the end of the meeting, I said I was keen to meet with everyone. I think I've met with a few of you so far, and I've got outstanding actions to catch up with everyone else. So I will make it round to everyone by the end of the summer, hopefully. But I've had I think I've caught up with 8 or 9 people from the policy committee, and I think for me, the policy committee is in a really interesting place. We've got a new convener at SCVO, we've got a new chief executive, a new chair, and I think as well the sector's probably at a point where there's a whole lot of things going on externally that is impacting us. It's quite an exciting time to take on the role. What's been really encouraging is all the conversations I've been having with members of the committee is that everyone's kind of got the same ideas and the same direction they want the committee to go in. I mean, it would be very weird for us as members of the committee to kind of feel it's not an important committee for SCVO, so everyone does think it's got an important role to play. There's probably a general consensus that it's not firing all cylinders yet, and there's some things we can do to get that going. Kind of the key themes that are coming up is that committees got a real important role as an advisory role for SCVO, some future thinking, forward thinking, rather than what the risk is now, but what's actually coming down the line for the sector. I think there's a real appetite to see the committee help set some of the agenda for SCVO and inform some of that, and provide insight from our daily roles in third sector organisations, not necessarily our roles in specific organisations. I think that's something that's come up, and I remember from my time at SCVO that members of the committee aren't members because they're from a certain charity. They're there as individuals with experience of the sector, and I think that's something that came up a number of times. There's been a number of people who've challenged me to kind of look at the size and composition of the committee. A number of people feel it's too big. It allows people to hide behind the numbers. I think there's 24 members of the committee at the minute. So a lot of coffee I've been drinking while I've been trying to get around and meet everyone. Probably not good for my heart. So there's a lot of people have been saying, is it too big? Should we be looking to rationalise the numbers, make it a little bit smaller, make people more accountable who are on the committee? And some of the suggestions are a slightly smaller committee, but actually at meetings would draw in experts depending on what topic we're speaking about. So that's something that I can throw into the mix. One message that's come back that's really clear is that the elections are very important, so people don't feel you should be co-opted or appointed onto the committee, but elections should be there. But there does definitely need to be space for a small number of co-options to make up for gaps that we have. So I think that was a clear message that came back. And I don't want to predetermine anyone's conversations I've not spoke to yet, so we can challenge some of these thoughts. For me, the kind of next steps is kind of more conversations, so I've still got a big chunk of the committee to catch up with, and then some form of discussion through the summer in the run up to the next meeting about with Shelley, John, possibly Anna and Andrew as well, about where the committee sits and where it goes forward. But I think the general consensus is that it could be a very useful committee for SCVO and the sector, and I think people want to kind of drag it back to that advisory insight role that maybe it's not had in the past. So that's kind of my update on that. Does anybody want to make any observations at this point in time? I know there's some people who I've not caught up with, but I'm sure we'll catch up at some point. Is that all good? Perfect. Yep. So so for the guys who are not caught up with, we've got something in the diary. Happy to do it over the phone or catch up in person, and then the plan is, I suppose, over the summer to kind of crystallise those thoughts and actually come up with something quite concrete which we'll share through base camp and things like that. So, okay, perfect. 10 minutes ahead of schedule. So you'll not get this in government.
Speed's not always a good thing.
That gives us a lot more time in the next point. So I think when so agenda item 4, we're in big picture to 2050. So what environment do we want the sector to work in 2050? It's probably an arbitrary date. We could go 2025, we can go 2031, which is 2 elections away. But I think when we were doing our pitch for Policy Committee Chair, both Neil and I said that we wanted the committee to do some big thinking going forward and move away from necessarily just focusing on issues, but actually start thinking about big forward thinking topics. And what I was very keen for this meeting to be, which might be the last of the current structure depending on what happens over summer, is for us to kind of break down into small groups and spend an hour just really asking ourselves what are the big challenges for the sector. I think there's an opportunity out of this session for us to look at some themes that keep coming up and maybe set a forward agenda and a work programme for the committee. So I don't want us to be constrained by what we think people want to hear. I think we need to go big. We need to think about what the real issues the sector are facing today, but what do we see coming down the line in 5-10 years' time? So the kind of structure of this kind of session will be, I think there's 8 committee members here, so we'll split into 2 floors. The first group is going to look at the social and political challenges for the sector, and that's going to be led by John. And then the second group is going to look at economic and technological challenges, which is going to be led by Rashir, so we can kind of just either divide down the middle as we are at the minute. And really think about what are we facing as third sector organisations, what do we see in our organisations, what do we see bigger picture, and think about what does that mean for the perfect operating environment for the third sector going forward. We're going to do half an hour on that, and then we're going to have a break and we'll swap over, and then once you've swapped over, each group is going to look at a SWOT analysis for some of the challenges that were identified. So if you're in John's group in Group 1, you'll be identifying the challenges, and then for the second session you'll be looking at what the strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats are for the sector. And hopefully from that, it's only going to be an hour, so we won't go real deep into it, but hopefully from there we'll start to see some big themes that we can maybe tackle as a policy committee going forward. Does that sound good to everyone? Perfect. So I suppose if there's a certain group you'd rather be in, then Michelle wants to.
I just wanted to ask a very quick question about the title. So this is what the environment we want the sector to work in 2050. Can I just request that we're also mindful that we've got the Sustainable Development Goals, which is due for 2030 as well.
Yeah.
That'll be a big milestone.
Yeah, so I mean, 2050 was pretty much an arbitrary date, to be honest. Hopefully I'll be retired by then. I wish. Yeah, I mean, I think really what I want to do is just push the boundary from thinking about what's happening this year, next year. A lot of third sector organisations will be starting to think about the election in 3 years' time, but actually, what are we looking at down the line? And some of the challenges that we might come up with might not be challenges for 10, 15 years, but they will eventually be coming down the line. So just really forward thinking, getting out of the kind of here and now, and the kind of day job, I suppose, and start to focus on that. So more than happy that people build things like that into their thoughts. And then like I said, hopefully it'll take us, give us a bit of an idea of what we're focusing on, and maybe we can craft a few agendas going forward around those topics and bring some experts into the room to help us form our ideas. So does that all sound good? So John, you'll be over this side. So this side will be social and political challenges, and then everyone else round Rashir for economic and technological.
We want to use 2 rooms.
Is there a room? Well, we could do that, and it'll save us. John, do you want to go?
Yeah.
Are we going to take the live link down for an hour, or are we just going to leave it running?
I'm just going to leave it running, if that's okay,
Yeah.
because once I stop it, I can't start.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's no problem at all. Do you want to?
No, I was going to say a few words. We were over, and we could maybe circulate a bunch of papers. Bashir and I, David and Lucy were over meeting with our colleagues from the other 5 councils and our sister organisations in Dublin on Thursday, Friday, and we had a feature session in the Thursday afternoon, and there was quite a lot of different papers circulated. The Wheel, who was hosting us in Dublin, had got this academic to do a paper on the future, and one of the speakers was a guy from Twitter who was, frankly, Jesus, I don't know who but claiming credit for it, every year people getting together, bringing communities together every campaign under the sun. But I think the thing that struck us, and I think we can circulate the papers, and might actually give some thinking. You know, some of the future stuff, and I expected the session would all be about AI and technology and robots, but actually the reality was it was all about people, particularly young people, and actually the sector itself. And it's just to throw in some stuff as hints in terms of, one of the things was, the point was raised was, what is the value of the sector, not the number of organisations, turnover, actually about our connectivity, the humanisation of services, and all that stuff, and actually what are our values now as a sector post the trust figures we released, the Oxfam scandal, and actually do we need to reposition what we stand for to engage a new generation, because there's new paradigms, new norms, a changing environment. And actually, funny, they didn't discuss technology. I know it was quite strange, but there was a lot of quite interesting papers. There was one from our colleagues in Northern Ireland, NICFA, about the future for the sector, looking at the changes in technology, but actually the sector's in the people business, and that is a real your paper was actually quite optimistic, whereas the other guy from the Wheel was academic. His paper was quite, it was like the future, is really death is nigh, doom and everything like that. Whereas it was quite contrasting people's different perspectives, and I think we can pull all them together, our colleagues in Wales, do some stuff around well-being, and actually circulate it through Basecamp for the third sector forum and that, because I don't think all the answers were there. There was quite a lot of good questions, some of that, and I think what I took from it was particularly around the repositioning of the sector, how we engage particularly young people, and I chaired the session with some of the young people's organisations in Tuesday, because I think that's a particular issue for us in terms of going forward, how we empower and engage, enable young people, because they're the future. And so I think I don't want that. The social and political is all great, but actually I don't think we need to think, we don't want to lose there.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're sharing out all those papers. We'll pull the.
Yeah, I think I'd be really interested to see if you could share them around the group, because again I think it all might help form some agenda going forward in terms of
what we decided to do using technology is what we've done is Shelley's put together a wiki page, right? And all of the information we're taking and putting in there, right? And we're inviting all the people that participated in that session last week also to put information in there, and we're also inviting people around this table to not just read it but to add to it as well. That way we start developing a collaborative resource, and we can tweak it all the time.
Yep.
Can I just make a suggestion for consideration, because I think this is a hugely important, really valuable discussion actually. I'm just wondering about the headings of these two groups, and whether there's an opportunity to make them slightly more focused on broad outcomes, rather than, so often looking at the social and political, economic, technological factors is part of a situation analysis rather than necessarily looking forward. Would there be any benefit to looking at the sector that we want to be? What might the sector look like in 2050? And then what might the society that we've helped to bring about look like in 2050? Just as either somehow within this, or as an alternative to those two. Just so that, because there might be some things that when we start thinking them through, might be a means to an end. Just a suggestion anyway.
Yeah, I think that these are it's obviously a very simple pest analysis, and that is to get us thinking really around bigger, broader ideas. And I'm very happy to look at outcomes and where we get to rather than problems. It's always better to look at the positive side.
I think they're both really, really important. It's just if we're looking at where we want to be by 2050, we might use that as a preliminary tool. But that vision, creating that vision. Just
and I think this is, for me, this is a departure from a kind of the old model of policy committee meetings and moving us forward. And actually, that might be a full meeting further down the line we might want to look at as well. So I'm happy for everyone to let's have the discussions, let's see what comes out of them. We've got some time for feedback, 15 minutes for feedback, so we can have a good further conversation about what comes out there further down the line. So does that sound all good? So John, your group's going to go next door, isn't it? So happy, everyone's going to get to cover both areas, so if you either want to identify the challenges or potential outcomes you might want to aim for, or you'd rather do a kind of swap it at the end, you can take your pick. Good. So I've got half an hour and then we'll swap
Can I just
over.
ask also, David, do you want to do the what we used to do, which is a facilitator and rapporteur, or?
Yeah, if someone can take a note of what comes out, and then I suppose John and Rashir, you can update the groups once they swap over, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Where we go, you stay here.
Before, what makes sense?
Oh yeah, jumps, yeah.
John, he was supposed to have us.
Go, you go next door. Yeah, you go for that, and then that leaves us for the people who can't count are staying in the economic table. That's 5 minutes. That's what it is. Well, we can't. We'll just sit here. It's small enough. Have you got any opening thoughts on what you've on this area?
Economy and technology?
Yeah.
Sure.
Start some.
Loads of things.
Go for it.
Yeah.
Give us a 5 minute.
My first thought is, in a way, it's interesting that you've put economy and technology together. Or you just gone. Well, it's interesting that he has put economy and technology together. I think you could probably put social and technology or political and technology. They all kind of interact. And I think for me, one of my big realizations on all of this stuff recently is if we start looking at all of this stuff as a system, as a holistic system, and the reason why I'm drawn to the Sustainable Development Goals, which of course it's got stuff like tackling poverty, improving gender equality, education, climate change, is because I think in the past we tried to treat all of these different things in isolation. So how do we improve our political system? How do we improve things in society? How do we improve welfare? Whereas now I've kind of realised you can't do one without doing the others, and they all interact. And so this climate change, tackling climate change, is totally relevant to social care.
Absolutely.
I walked into the middle of somebody and I'm like, oh, she's saying.
So it's that kind of thing, and I think the reason why I kind of realised this is because we did some work with young people, and young people. The first thing young people said to us is, "We're not the future, we're now." And the second thing they latched onto the Sustainable Development Goals because they felt that actually spoke their language and their agenda. They were the first to say that when it comes to improving educational outcomes, they wanted to make a link between that and gender, and tackling poverty, and health, and good nutrition and all that kind of stuff. So they saw the links between it, even though we'd asked them to kind of like focus on a particular sustainable development goal. Right? Can you go and give a young person perspective on this SDG? Pick which one you want. They didn't pick one; they picked multiple ones, and they looked at how they went through.
Yeah.
And that's
People
the-
don't live their lives in a single silo, do they? I fully support that systems approach. I think that's going to be really important, and I think it's nice to be looking beyond the Sustainable Development Goals, but I agree with you that 2030 is a key milestone to think about on that journey. I think it will open other opportunities for us as a sector to think more holistically as well. I think it will be absolutely vital in terms of increasing pressure on the public purse, using government resources more effectively and in a more targeted way. It stands to reason that if we can take a holistic approach, we'll have more impact. So yeah, absolutely agree.
That's kind of where you were going with what you said at the start of this.
Yes, yeah, that's right, yeah. So, I think, in terms of the economy, what's interesting, I think, is that the conversation is already starting to change. So, looking at the discussions about going beyond GDP and what that might mean, and looking at quality of life and well-being and resilience and so on, all of these things are already quite hot topics, and it's really just about how we as a sector can contribute effectively to that conversation to help turn some of these big concepts into reality, because I think very often at the conceptual level, it's quite easy for people to accept that everything is connected, but at the operational level, it's sometimes quite difficult to identify what to prioritise amongst so many complex possibilities. And preventative spend, I think, is an area where SCVO could probably engage effectively in terms of some advocacy informed by all sorts of different organisations. Taking that long-term view and looking at the interconnectedness of those different aspects.
I think it's quite interesting that we're at a stage where everything you're talking about is now, and it is. What I think personally, what I would think we should be is looking at keeping some of that good talk really embedded in the future. But if you look at the cycles that things go in, what worries me, and I'm not usually Mrs. Pessimistic, is by the time we get to 2030 or 2050, we'll be back in a cycle where everything's about institutions and we'll have gone back to
We'll be saying things like we tried that in 2015.
Exactly, yeah, I know, we see all that and stuff never worked. And that worries me, so I suppose what I think is, but maybe it's just life, maybe that's natural, I probably wouldn't even still be alive in 2050, but I kind of think, how do we, my tendency would be to how do we embed all that stuff that you're talking about to make it the norm rather than it being the new thing, so that it was, by the time we're down that line, it's people are thinking about how do we take that forward to another level rather than thinking how do we dismantle it and turn us back into some sort of.
On the kind of preventive spend stuff and thinking economics, I had a really interesting conversation with Russell Gunnison at IPPR, and one of the things that the challenge he was putting to me for the sector was how we can be more responsible in what we ask government, in terms of, we're all asking the government to spend lots of money on lots of stuff, but if they spend lots of money on my thing, it means they're not spending it on Heather's, or they're not spending it on Joe's. And actually, how do we as a sector get better at making representation to government about how much it actually costs this and where that money will come from? And there's a big conversation, a bigger conversation going to snowball over the next few years about revenue raising powers in the Scottish Parliament, and if we're asking them to invest an extra 100 million into heart disease, then where's that 100 million going to come from? It's going to come from someone else's purse, or they have to find a way to raise money. And I don't think we're good in the sector at saying that to government, that we want you to do this, and by the way, here's ways you can do it. And I think that is a big challenge for the sector now, and something we probably need to get better at going forward. Otherwise, we're all just going to start stealing money from each other. And
that's where your point about all everything being interlinked comes in, that you would have to be able to accept that there's so much we're not talking about. You'd have to be able to accept that to help, heart sort of disease or whatever, that actually lots of money needs to go into housing, or lots of money needs to go into something to do it.
Totally
And that's
agree with
quite
that,
hard for individual organisations.
And I just don't think across the board we're there, the third sector yet to say that, I mean, for heart disease, just taking that as an example, tackling health inequalities or tackling inequalities period is probably the best thing you could do.
As part of that challenge, about the leadership of the the charities and the boards and the chief executives not having the KPIs, for example, or I'm going to get an extra 100 million for this key thing, and it's actually these other things you talked about that actually, in a way, help with the bottom line they're trying to achieve. But I think their pressures are going to be on, we have to solve this problem that we exist for. And the easiest way to solve that is if government just hands us a check to direct interventions. So how does this organisation help support or bring together those leaders and able to talk about the different things that they can do, or the things that they should be buying in that's actually going to help benefit their campaign issue or whatever it is they're delivering service, without calling for just extra.
Yeah, I think it's a really valid. In 2050, is there an organisation or a group of organisations or a body that's driving that leadership in the sector, or has it already done it and we're through the other side of it, you know, that, I think so.
We had a really interesting conversation with the Five Nations last Thursday, which John gave a little reflection on. And I think we kind of like all came to the same conclusion that young people, particularly millennials, so the young millennials who are now coming of age, they have grown up through a couple of decades of austerity, climate change impacts, you know, the globalization, massive technology change, and inequality, huge inequality. And I think if you speak to many young people today, they feel really responsible. They a kind of responsibility which I've not seen from a number of generations before. And I think what we realised is we were looking at the campaign in America, the gun control campaign, and the young kids who, you know, when all the politicians and organisations are all frozen, the young people were doing a march for our lives and that kind of stuff. And you know, initially they just wanted to do it when they were using social media and all this kind of stuff, Twitter campaigns. Then money started coming in from different sources. They realised they couldn't just have it come into their bank accounts. They had to set up organised structures with governance. Suddenly all the traditional charity form came into play. And so, you know, but it was that way around. They were starting with a vision and campaigns and everything. And the charities and everything became a vehicle for it, rather than what you were saying, which is the other way around, where charity has to kind of prove its existence and all that kind of stuff. So I think there's something here, and we concluded that we need to think about how we make charities as a channel relevant to young people and people who want to change society. So it's not about how do we engage young people, how do we engage people who want to change. It's how we make this stuff relevant. And for me, I think the big shift for me, I think, is us starting to think not in terms of we're the charity sector and there are people there, but we are all people. And this is what we do through government, this is what we do through charities, this is what we do through business. And then you start changing the nature of the debate. Then it's no longer about, you know, asking government for money. It becomes about, well, through government, we're going to spend taxes on this, this, and this. But in order to get to the outcome, we might well need to kind of like support charities to do this, this, and that, and public sector agencies, local authorities to do this, and so on. So you start thinking about all the resources that are available to us as a society that we can make use of. And then it kind of frees you from this kind of territorialism of my charity needs to survive compared to yours, and I will get my campaign through and this kind of stuff.
I think you're right, Lucia. I think it is about that ownership, isn't it, of shared goals. And I think there are charities, well, including my own, which have publicly said, you know, we would like not to exist. And so
most charities exist to not exist.
That's right. So I think, you know, we need to, it is a mindset change in some cases, but I think there are enough charities out there already that are happy to say, look, we would like not to be here anymore, and it's not actually just about us being territorial. I mean, I know the reality obviously is much more complicated than that. From year to year, when charities have got really important work to deliver and they're you know, struggling to bring in resources and so on. But I think you're absolutely right, and maybe in terms of ownership, giving people ownership of a broader range of areas that contribute to the solutions that they want. It's not actually about, you know, robbing Peter to pay Paul. It's about feeling like you want Paul to succeed and you're actually working with Paul, isn't it, to take that to its next.
I think there's also a sub-level of that ties into, rather than kind of within the sector, public awareness of charities has to come into that as well, and because that's another major aspect of economic issues, is the potentially uninformed general public saying, why do charities exist, why isn't it just volunteers, why are charities taking government money? It's the same issues, but it's a different level of arguing that and making the case to both the uninterested and the disinterested, I suppose.
And we're probably been kind of lulled into a kind of state of relaxation where we've not really had to justify why we exist for such a long time, and now probably since 2010 there's been this kind of snowballing effect of stories that are either true or not true or not reported correctly, or the Oxfam scandal, and suddenly everything starts to snowball, and now every charity is in a position where whether it's a small local charity or a multinational, we're suddenly getting asked why do you exist, what are you doing with money, and I think that's just a kind of mindset of us kind of, you know, we maybe need to get ourselves out of well, we've always existed, so that's why we exist, rather than, you know, and get to
The
a
most
point of
obvious
saying,
things are the most difficult to explain.
yeah,
Sometimes
and get back to
it's
saying, here's what we do, and
Yeah.
you know, I think sometimes also we were having this conversation. I had an away day the last couple of days with the BHF, and we were talking about this, that our biggest donor profile, who's most likely to give to the BHF, they're not interested in what we're doing, they're more interested in what we've done. And we tend not to talk about what we've done because we just kind of think that's written, you know what we've done. But actually, you know, in our segmentation work, the group that's most likely to give to the BHF, the reason they don't do it is they don't know what we've done. And you know, and I think, and you know, if you're sitting there in a comms role, you're like, well, it's obvious what we've done. We've done this, we've done that, but actually we're not getting that message out there. And I think that's where we've got it on the agenda later on. You know, Jenny and the team at SCVO are looking at the 20 in 20 campaign that's going to look at the 20 big lobbying successes the sector's had, because lobbying's a dirty word right now, but actually if you go back through the 20 years of devolution, you know, probably every major piece of legislation started off with a third sector idea or a third sector campaign, and maybe now's the time for us to go back and talk about that. I mean, one of the interesting things that came up for us, that was, I'm not involved in this world, but you know, if we're talking about economics, you know, the still vast majority of the sector relies on donations from the public, and if we, you know, want to talk about cash donations, and actually what was really interesting is a lot of the work that we've done, it shows that Scottish people were the least likely to put their hands in the pocket, but most likely to give time and do things. And actually, what does that mean then for the sector going forward? Will that trend stay, or will it, and will charities move to adapt to that? But also when they looked at current public outlook in terms of the financial situation across the UK, Scots are the most pessimistic about the economy going forward. And what does that then mean for people putting their money? You know, like you said, there's, you know, nearly 15, 20 years of austerity. What does that then mean for the sector in terms of donations coming in? If government money is drying up and funding's no longer kind of sustainable, how does the third sector adapt to maybe not getting that £15 a month direct debit coming through, but somebody coming to the door and saying, I'm happy to work 2 days a week for you, or I'm happy to work in the shop, or and I don't think most organisations are ready to work out what that means for them.
Okay.
I think the mechanics of fundraising will definitely evolve, and you know, technology will be a part of that, and I think the whole kind of social contract will, you know, could potentially change enormously by 2050, or even by 2030. I think your point about the track record, you know, what the sector collectively has achieved is really important, and again, that's about outcomes. It's not so much about process or structures, I think that's certainly going to be very important in terms of building trust among the general public. But I think if we look at what we've achieved as a sector over the past however many decades, that should help us frame what we aim to achieve in the coming decades. And I think what's interesting is that, I mean, yesterday I spent the day at an event where you know, there were people there who are absolutely passionate that, you know, social change in the future will come from business. You know, B Corps, businesses engaged in their communities, you know, full of millennials who are passionate about changing things, or not necessarily full, but you know, there's a significant number of their workforce interested in these things. Government is obviously having to think differently. So I think that focus on outcomes and the SDGs is almost a necessary precursor to any of the rest of it, because then the money will follow, because actually people are clear on what we need to achieve. Then actually all sorts of things will start hopefully to align.
Can I also mention the thing you mentioned about B Corps? Everybody here knows what B Corps, the B Corps movement is, yes? This is like businesses with a kind of social conscience, and there's a whole kind of infrastructure around it, and TED Talks and all that kind of stuff. And there's a movement in the US, and led in the US in particular, to try and develop that. It's going to be something that will become increasingly increasingly profile in the coming year.
Yeah.
Now, my understanding of a lot of the kind of drivers behind that is things like the Kickstarter movement, where people can crowdsource their own funding to get funding started, rather than relying on, you know, patrons from big business and so on. And that frees them up to kind of like do things on their own terms. Small businesses and business enterprises and people setting up small business enterprises be very quick to kind of latch on to this kind of new technology approaches. The third sector has not. So we're still doing things like, you know, relying on giving platforms and so on. We're not thinking in the same kind of way of how can we give people a stake in what the charity's about. It's about how do we get money off them, not how do we kind of get them to own it. And I think that's part of the issue here. And one of my hobby horses is about transparency and openness. And I'd like to just play that in here because, in a way, if you look at the Oxfam scandal, I think it kind of is quite telling that people now, in an era of fake news, they expect more transparency from organisations, from people. They're not going to settle for spin anymore. So we could well come out and, you know, we have to be really careful with this 2020 thing, right? We could come out and say, look how brilliant we are, and carefully crafted messages, which have been like, you know, checked by comms people and all that, etc., etc., etc. People will see right through that. They don't want to be fed stuff anymore. They want to know, be able to get at the access to truth themselves. They're in an era where they can Google things. They're not, you know, you can't hide things from people anymore. And I think in that kind of context, it isn't so much about what our message is. It's about actually what are we actually doing and how are we making it completely open and transparent what we're doing and why. And I think then people start to trust us more.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I think that's a very fair point.
In terms of another kind of big economic challenge further down the pipeline, migration changes, and obviously for those leaving the EU in some way or another, that's going to massively impact on who's coming to the UK, where they're coming from, what our workforce looks like in terms of shortages, to be frank, in terms of employees and in certain sectors and certain skill sets. You know, I don't know what that's going to look like in 2 years' time.
It's
It's 30, 40
it's
years' time.
it's an incredibly valid point. I mean,
That's going to be a huge challenge.
you know, I don't know if we've done a sector analysis in Scotland, but I mean, like 26% of people, researchers refund at Beach for EU nationals, and I think it was like 19% of our workforce are EU nationals, so like, and that's probably reflected across the sector, and some areas it might be even higher, but I think it's definitely a challenge coming down the line.
Elsa is working on something to do that. Elsa is working on
Is she? Yeah. So I think
She's estimated 3,500 in Scotland.
across the sector, yeah. And that's a big challenge for the sector. You know, you could essentially get 5-10 years down the line and suddenly skills are lost, and I think, I mean, how you tackle that, that's I have no idea, but I think it's something that's worth raising and worth talking about.
I think there's actually an important role for the sector to do some of that future gazing and to be flagging up issues that we collectively see, and actually convening opportunities for people to start doing that sort of looking ahead, because naturally, you know, government is shorter term in much of its decision making, just because of pressures on the budgets and so on.
And it's often firefighting rather than.
And that's where I think, you know, the sector that we're in can actually help to counterbalance that. Because it's not, I mean, I think the EU issue is really, really important actually, but also the changing demographics means that there'll be a change in the number of people who are economically active. So that's going to change all sorts of things.
I think that's that's a really valid, often in this, you know, any conversation in the third sector, you talk about an ageing population, you start talking about, you know, health burden and all this other stuff, but actually there is you know, if you're going back to fundraising, there's a huge issue around the baby boomers are actually the generation most likely to give to a charity, millennials not so much. I mean, you know, now most of them can't get a deposit together till they're, you know, late 30s, 40s, you know, where they're going to put their hand in their pocket and give you a tenner or whatever. And maybe the issues that a baby booming generation are more likely to adopt compared to the issues that millennials, it might change the demographic of the income flow within the sector as well. And you know, it's something that we're doing a lot of thinking around, and I think, you know, it's something that charities need to be aware of. I don't know how you know, SCVO has a role, or how as a sector we have that discussion, but I think it's something we very much, you know, if we get, you know, 100 25-year-olds turn up at our door saying we want to volunteer for you, what can we do? But then we don't have 100 people giving us a tenner. Well, what does that equation look like?
Yeah.
Do we have something for them to do that helps us achieve our goal and things like that? So I think as a sector, you know, there's discussions there to be.
Can I ask you a question about BHF and organisations like BHF, where there's lots of charity shops? Is there an issue as well about charity shops and who volunteers for them then?
I don't know if there's an issue. I mean, we still, so there's really interesting actually. If you go down to our Leith store, for example, we've got an incredible turnover of volunteers in there, but they tend to be Eastern Europeans who've arrived in Scotland.
Okay.
They'll do 3-4 months and then they get a job in Next or Debenhams or somewhere like that. Debenhams might be a good example after their recent announcement that they're struggling, but you know, so I mean, we've done a big piece of work at BHF about the value of our shops more than just bringing money in terms of giving people experience and going on. Actually, a lot of our managers and assistant managers started off as volunteers and things like that. But I think the volunteering demographic, and it's really interesting when you go into our shops. You either get retirees or really young people, and there's kind of no middle ground. Maybe if I went on a weekend, I might find somebody who does a day a month or something like that. But the challenge around volunteering is it's no longer the simple model of someone coming in and saying I want to do 3 days a week. You know, we've got people who come in and say I want to do 6 hours every 6 weeks, but not if it's an even day, and then we're having to like structure, you know, we're having to respond to that, and then we've got people coming in saying I want to volunteer but I only want to do the tills, or I want to volunteer but I only want to do the stockroom, and you know, whereas before it was like volunteer in a shop and we'll put you somewhere, whereas now we're having to completely change our model to, like we've got corporate partnerships where they give us an employee once a week for a day, and they've maybe got 600 employees, so you only do it once every 2 years, but somebody comes from the office, works in the shop, and then the next week it's something different, and so you're having to really, you know, that model of kind of a volunteer fits in a box just doesn't exist anymore, and actually technology is really, you know, we probably talk typical third sector, we'll probably talk more about economics, but technology is a really interesting thing in that, you know, we've got people who are, you know, want to volunteer for us, but they live in a rural community, and how do we connect them to with the BHF through, you know, Skype for Business, or you know, how can we tap into some of the potential? So like we've got a helpline, you know, I often ask the question, does all our helpline or people need to sit in our office in London? We just need to provide them with a phone somewhere where they are and know that they've got training and support, and actually how do we start to push, you know, our services out rather than...
This was something I was hoping to raise as well, because it's kind of linked to a point which I've been recognising, which is, you know, we talk a lot about the ageing population and the burden on the NHS, etc., social care and all that kind of stuff. But if you look at this from an economic and technological perspective, the two together, the reason why we've got a problem with an ageing population is because we've drawn a boundary around Western Europe, or even around the United Kingdom, where there's an aging population. If you look globally, there's a lot of young people, you know. So the global demographics is not aging in the same way as, you know, the population if you look just in Scotland. And technology, where does that bring in? Because if you look at the, you know, where jobs are going to be situated, and you mentioned the point about rural Scotland, why not in other countries as well? So you can bring in you can bring in a wider economic system, where people could be working remotely. And even in a social care setting, you know, issues like, for example, they were recently looking at whether people with, let's say, Alzheimer's, whether they would prefer the 15-minute type home visit type approach, or whether they'd prefer a chatbot who they could just keep firing questions to, and that chatbot would not get frustrated and say, you asked me that question the 10th time now, I'm giving you the answer the 10th time. So you know, there's an interesting parallel here with solving social problems we've got here. If we kind of think a bit more broadly, then we'd be.
I think some of the problem for the sector in social care might be entirely different, but I think what I've often seen third sector organisations go is, how do I harness technology to get my message out or engage with more people to give us money, rather than how do I use technology to achieve what. So for example, and I think technology is a real interesting bit when you look at Brexit and leaving the EU. So BHF, for example, we've just funded research in Singapore and Germany. Now traditionally we only fund in the UK, that's what our charter was, but we've now started to say, well, you know, it doesn't matter where the research is funded. It's actually about where the expertise is, and we're now a global society where people can connect. My grand's got one of those button things that she pushes if she falls over. The person that picked up the phone's in Birmingham. Like, they don't need to be in Edinburgh, because all they do is say, "You all right?" And she's like, "Oh yeah, I just pushed it by mistake." You know, and actually, how do you start to look at, you know, that growth, you know, expanding of it? I mean, technology, eBay. So BHF now sells stuff on eBay. We've just hit the £10 million mark. 25% of sales go abroad. So that's a donation market that BHF's never ever. You're never going to get somebody from Japan walking into a shop in Glasgow, and you know, they might by chance on holiday, but they see a watch that somebody's donated, we put it on eBay, and suddenly we're posting it away. And actually, I think one of the challenges, and I was quite keen in technology, was on there, and that I think a lot of third sector organisations have looked at how do we use it to maximise our message and get over the top of all the other messages that are going out there, but actually it's about how can technology influence how we do what our day job, rather than just to bring in money.
There's also something in terms of ageing population, and supposing harking back slightly to my old job, but the ageing population shouldn't be seen as a burden, social care shouldn't be seen as a burden, because actually it's an untapped, the ageing population are mainly healthy, and you know, and are actually, you know, an untapped resource in terms of employment. We're talking about more people not being economically active. They will be people just older and economically active. Some of us are more built in terms.
Just looking from the volunteering perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you're good to report back to the group that comes in about the things that you stay here?
I don't know, I think it probably would be better, because then I can meet the other people.
Yeah, absolutely, that'd be perfect.
Are you staying here as well?
Yeah.
Did you all work all this out in advance? Because I've kind of, so you know what you're doing.
So we worked out that Rashir and I were going to be team 2, and
Right, okay.
John and Elsa were going to be team 1, is what we discussed.
But you also turned into Ruth.
Yeah, well, Elsa's, I think, hopefully going to be here soon, because you might notice that she is speaking.
Yeah.
On the agenda.
I just thought you were going to use technology, you know, and
That could happen, we'll see.
where's your
So it's out of the door there, and you go through the door, and it's on the right.
Okay.
So it's, once you go through the 2 doors, then you do the little, you'll see
it's like through that wall, but you have to go through 2 doors on the way.
Okay.
And the last thing about technology, it's maybe worth, if anyone hasn't heard of it, to look up the local cornerstone.
What was that, sorry?
Local cornerstone.
Okay.
Yeah, so they've like completely restructured how Cornerstone works to have independent teams.
Self-management teams.
And yeah, I think that probably is going to, well, from what they've said, that they have had really big positive response from other organisations across the sector who are really interested in how they've approached the self-management teams, and maybe that is going to be a model going forward, and it's a model that allowed them to upskill their workforce and pay their workforce more but have less managers, which I think is really positive for, if we're thinking about the future, fair work and gender equality, so it's interesting.
There would be some people with a more cynical view of it than obviously Cornerstone have themselves, but I think it's the future. It's based on the Barcelona model.
What's the cynical view?
Is that some organisations are getting lots of really skilled managers who you know are no longer working at Cornerstone, so they're quite pleased to be getting them. But that it's a bit of a way of just having lots of people who are not in senior positions, and so in a way it's kind of reducing costs though it looks like you're, you're upping people's wages, but you're taking out a whole layer of management. And there's also a lot of people who are really worried about the lack of control. I think lack of control is the fantastic thing about it. There's some really, really good stuff going on. They just give, there's a team of people in a local area, they tell them who their service users are, and they just work it themselves, who visits who and when and all that, and it's perfectly fine.
Hopefully we move sort of at a step.
Strips out a lot of
Yeah.
unnecessary
There's not a lot
bureaucracy.
inside.
Yeah.
It's down to the simple. Even if there's something like
Alright.
they were smart, particularly who now will be obsessive about it, but being careless in it, but also say regulators are hate it, and they'll never be able to do it because regulators are hate it. And we, as cube sector,
Oh, I'm
Something that's a lot similar arguments about we get from government company orders.
So like, for like,
So
not
I sure
taking people
they
back.
really get handled. They'll say, well, we didn't possibly do that because
For note taking.
and we speak to one in Scotland.
Or Steve,
But we should be doing this.
exactly, absolutely, it's so funny all that. It's everything is about speaking up.
I kind of thought he was in there.
Okay, my water.
Sorry, you
No.
kind of made this land. Okay, so I think we should maybe, no one can get in touch with Elsa.
Oh,
So
I phoned her now, if she does.
I think Ruth has tried to phone her, so I think that we should be aware that we may have more time to spend on something else, or John could maybe present on the statistics, because I think Elsa's not going to be here. And my 20 and 20 thing is just a very short summary, just to say what Jenny's doing and when the deadlines are.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
have a bit of-
additional empathy maybe.
That's the second best essentially.
I can do the sector statistics bit,
Okay,
and John could do the war on charities.
okay.
But she'll be in another building somewhere, finding out if she's okay.
I think that she emailed me this morning. I think that maybe what's happened, but she didn't say she wasn't coming. She emailed me about the split payments. I think she possibly has thought that we were in Edinburgh,
Oh.
and that maybe she has went to Hayway, or because she's definitely at work,
Okay.
but she's not in Glasgow. Yeah.
Still rolling, by the way.
Elsa.
Right.
Do you want me to give her a quick call?
Yeah.
I mean, Ruth did already
Yeah.
try.
Have you got her personal mobile as well?
I don't know her personal mobile.
Okay. Are you okay to feed back, and I'll just go and give her a quick call?
Okay.
So far away now for
Oh no, because that's a retaining room, isn't it? Yeah.
So I'll just state some of the things that was raised last time. So a need for a holistic system, and we talked a bit about the SDGs and how when we start to think about things, a lot of different priorities actually all link together. We talked a bit about an example of asking young people to talk about the SDGs, and they were asked to choose a specific goal, but instead they talked about links between, for example, health, poverty and educational attainment. So basically we were just talking about how it's hard to pick specific items to focus on when everything's so related. We talked a bit about the economy and how conversations around that are already starting to change. So people are starting to talk more about well-being, quality of life and resilience when they talk about the economy. We talked more about how we make a lot of asks of government, but are the sector good at communicating how those asks will be paid for? And how we should be aware that when we ask for something to be paid for, it means something else can't be, or funds need to be raised. So how can we as a sector become better at communicating where money should come from, or talking about how money could be raised, and maybe that's a big thing that we don't do so much right now. We talked a bit about how we should, instead of, I think the analogy was used, instead of robbing Peter to pay Paul, we should support Paul as well. You know, if what their goal is might actually feed into our goal, and maybe the sector need to, you know, think more broadly. The example was BHF working on heart disease, and actually inequality in general has a big contribution to heart disease. Same with cancer. How can we think about broader pictures around that? We talked about how the mechanics of fundraising is changing, which I'm sure people here are quite aware of. There was an example of B Corps, which I haven't heard of before, businesses with a social conscience, and how effective they may be. So if no one here knows too much about that, maybe we won't talk much about that in this session. We talked as well about fake news, and how when more fake news is around, there is a bigger expectation for the sector to be more transparent, and how we can try to be more transparent and empower people to learn about things that we work on. So not just the messages we want to give them, but how we can empower them to learn about things that we do in greater detail, be more involved in the things that we do. We talked about migration challenges, and if there's going to be sort of shortages or different skills in the future. But it was also raised that we should remember that globally, demographics aren't aging in the same way as Scotland, and maybe when we think about aging population, maybe that's something that we take for granted, and we have, you know, there's maybe artificial boundaries that we put in place that it doesn't need to be. We talked about how the sector need to have more opportunities to think in the longer term, and we need to be more aware that government thinks in the short term, and maybe we shouldn't be as influenced as we are by government thinking in that way. Just because government thinks a certain way, we should go beyond that. We talked about the value of charity shops beyond bringing money, and then we talked about how the third sector tend to focus on harnessing technology to bring money in, rather than maybe for the benefit of their beneficiaries, which I think is fairly new. So to be fair to ourselves, I think that that's something that a lot of these technological advances are new and are just beginning, and there's organisations, you know, in the sector who are just starting out to do little projects. Untitled UK, for example, there's a lot of chatbot examples. So maybe we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves with that, but it's something that we should start thinking about. How can we harness these new technologies to help more issues? So the chatbot example, I think it was Arthritis UK, well, whoever it was, their people with the condition could talk to the chatbot about their condition and get responses on their questions. When I first heard about this example, I thought it was really bad, and I was like really negative about it, and I was like, oh no, like loneliness and social isolation. But actually work on different chatbots have found that people preferred the chatbot to speaking to a person, because they felt that there was no judgment. So if you maybe have a certain thing that you feel you find it difficult to speak about, and you can ask a chatbot about it, then it's completely judgment free. So they actually found it. Yeah, I know it was. I was surprised that a lot of people actually said no, they liked chatbot. So
I suppose that's like a kind of a misunderstanding about technology as well, isn't it? That it's neutral, and it's absolutely not. It's not at all in any sense. It's not neutral who puts the money in, it's not neutral who produces it, it's not neutral what the outcomes are. So if someone has programmed that bot to say certain things, it could very well be judgmental if someone programmed it to be, you know.
yeah,
And so I think that can't be a kind of a given that technology is neutral, same as, you know, Facebook's not neutral, and the use of data is not neutral. You know, someone is choosing how to do these things, and actually very often in big tech companies, isn't it? It's a very small group of individuals that's kind of replicated across the sector. It isn't like our sector, people working in it, and they don't necessarily have that same values base to produce those
I
things.
think that's linked to like algorithm bias.
Yeah.
So when you give technology, you have to put information in, and maybe there hasn't been like enough reflection on the information that you feed in, which can result in algorithm bias. I think one example I read was that if I was to look, I'm pretty sure it's on Google, for a job, because I'm female, it would present to me lower paid jobs than the male colleagues in this room. Because obviously
Even
from
simpler than
everything you
that.
do on your computer, it knows who
Yeah.
you are. Yeah.
Even simpler than that, I've seen stuff about like hand dryers in toilets that have sensors that actually if you're a person of colour, it doesn't necessarily always pick up that your hand is there to be dried, because actually they've obviously programmed it to be white people with their hands there, and that's what the sensor can sense. And we know that with like face recognition software that again, people of colour, it's not very good at picking up. So even like things that seem in our minds, if you accept it at face value, as being really simple, hand dry, you put your hands there and it dries it, that isn't, it's not neutral for everybody. So I think obviously that's like a super simplistic version of that.
Try being Scottish with the voice recognition.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So, and if we then think about that as
But all that,
being more complicated.
all that will get much, much better as it develops.
You'd hope so, but again, it's not neutral who's making those hiring decisions and
Yeah, but
who's
think of who
there.
the market is. The market's not all white. So, I mean, I'm just like, I think you're being sensible but overly cynical.
There you go. Well, yeah, there you go.
It is something that in the testing phase for these things, that no one ever think, like should we do some testings, around different.
Yeah, exactly.
They have just taken things totally for granted.
But, this is big companies like Apple that are doing this. It's not small players. It's people with a lot of money and a lot of resource to put into those kind of things.
But going back to your point on the bot, are we coming at it only from one direction of like, okay, so how do we improve the technology to phase out that bias, rather than asking that initial question of, is it a problem that people might feel judged by another human being?
Yeah.
So like, I suppose it's just saying, yes, the technology is a really important part of it, and optimising that for the best possible outcome is great, but actually, do we then sort of go down a false path of only sort of trying to engineer a solution that fits, rather than saying like, actually maybe there's another problem here at the basis of this that we ought to be exploring as well.
I think that's kind of like technological culture, I suppose, of like actually, and if you think of young people, really have almost kind of dual personas of what they're like online and what they're like in person, and that distance is creating that, I don't know.
Yeah, and there's potential problems there as well if people do have that sort of alter ego, as it were, online, of what information do they then get on health or other bits as well, if they're, if this is all done by sort of machine learning, AI, and like logarithms, and then it's providing people with either wrong information or fake news, fake information, because that's what's been targeted then, because that's being based on their experience, is there potential for harm there as well? Because I think, again, it goes back to the point you made about technology not being neutral, and I think I'm going to be the first one to use the B word today about Brexit. As well, there was a course I did this year, and it was on the ethics and governance of e-health, and looking at some of the regulations, and there's one bit that people I think at the moment don't have any conception of, is the fact that with the GDPR going into effect, obviously it won't still apply unless the UK chooses to continue to do so at the end of whenever Brexit happens, that then people's data is basically a bit of a free-for-all in terms of the globalised and international market. At the moment it's very restricted by data protection regulations from Europe, but the potential for that then, once Brexit happens, is absolutely huge. And the UK, for countries which are outside of the EU at the moment, if it's not felt that they have particularly stringent sort of data protection laws, privacy laws, etc., the countries will be deemed as sort of unsafe environments, and you can't then send information to them. UK will be one of those countries that once Brexit comes into effect, that Europe won't be able to, they won't be able to share information with us on across a range of different platforms, because we'll be getting unsafe because of Snooper's chapter. And unless that's going to be amended anytime soon, which it doesn't appear it's going to be, the future for technology actually might be a bit more limited for us actually, because we're going to be really impeded, especially from a European perspective. It then gives us more freedom to, with other countries, but at the expense of protections and the safety of sort of privacy and data.
What kind of stuff is that in relation to health?
And anyone's data, so data within health, but also just your sort of the data that's collected from you when you're on the internet, from your apps, from your phone, from anything, will then, at the moment, it can't be shared with, you can't transfer it to another country unless it's deemed that they have, I say, significantly stringent regulations in place. Once we're outside, that won't apply anymore.
That's why she wouldn't be serving.
Really?
Yeah, because it's based in America and it doesn't have any of the protection rules. And you're just saying you're giving all your information to the NSA or whatever they're called. And never use it. Never use it.
But yeah, so just considerations like that, as much as like there's obviously positive potential for technology going forward across a whole range of different sectors, there's also real risks for the future as well. And the bit about it's probably relates more to societal perception as well, about children and young people's attitudes, or the sort of upcoming generations and their attitude towards this as well. If you told people 20, 30 years ago that, by the way, your every step is going to be tracked, every coffee shop visit, every visit to whatever, is going to be at the limit, someone else is going to have access to that data, is going to use it in all sorts of magnificent ways. People would be absolutely horrified and freaked out. And now everyone has a device in their pocket, anyone to be able to do that, but it become
It's fantastic as a
normal.
parent, I have to say. track my daughter.
I think that's for young people actually, when they're involved and engaged and understand terms and conditions and actually the implications of data sharing, they don't like it. But it's because actually it's not, it's very easy to download these things. Yes, I agree with the terms and conditions, haven't read it, don't know what they are, don't know what terms and conditions mean, but actually when young people understand those, they don't want it. So the whole, we've heard of 5 rights, so it's about young people's rights in digital spaces, and it's quite interesting of looking at what those young people have said are like the main things that we should be looking out for, and certainly we're trying to integrate 5 rights plus GDPR together into the work that we're doing.
I think that's an interesting shift, because we obviously people dementia, we're looking at sort of different ways technologies can be used, and also a huge amount of issues around sort of rights, privacy around there as well. But and very different perspectives and perceptions that people have. So people are just kind of, yeah, what GDP thing, it was go walking, with potentially was that, and it's fine, people can find me, whereas more formalised services might kind of go, we're tracking people, and there's people coming to from really different angles, but I don't think always consider that other bit as well. So I think awareness raising of, yes, technology is great, there's lots of potential, but the other side of it, I think it's only just coming into sort of mainstream public consciousness, just how much, the Facebook examples, just how exposed people actually are digitally.
So it's about this bit like ethics.
Yeah, a bit.
I think there's a mindset thing as well, isn't it? I mean, even in our own sector, we've kind of got to a position with our charity work with donors and stakeholders that we kind of think of them as, that we hold their data and we kind of like manipulate that, and we kind of think, right, okay, we'll use that for this mail shot, we'll use it for this. And one of the things I've been quite keen on is how can we look at this the other way around? So instead of us being like these big institutions that hold data on people and manipulate them and do what we want and organise that according to what we need, how can people own their own data? They can then decide who they share that data with. They can use data brokers to kind of say, right. And the key thing is, not only will they then be sharing their data with institutions that they trust, but also they can then decide to share their data with other people who might have the same health conditions that they might have, or might have the same interests. That then supports more voluntary activity, and allows people to empower themselves by forming coalitions with others, all off the back of data, if people had the ability to own their own data. And of course you can have safeguards built into that kind of system, but it's a much more progressive way of looking at data than the current system where big institutions or big corporates own data on individuals and then do what they want with that. It also takes a more human rights-based approach. In fact, with the identity assurance system that the Scottish Government is currently developing, some of that kind of thinking is now starting to be used as the basis for that, because they got stung quite badly a few years ago when they wanted to share everybody's identification data across all the public bodies. So this is the complete inverse of that approach, where people decide who they want to share data with. I think that should be the default. And then you add on a layer of safeguarding, so of course there are situations when you have to kind of make exceptions, but the default is that people know their own information and they decide who to share it with.
There needs to be a real discourse with the public about all that though, because people will, it so depends on how you frame the question. Because the reason that it started with the MyGov Scot and all that kind of thing, with the single authentication, was because people were so fed up with having to log in different ways to the public sector system, where you had to have a password for your housing benefit and another password for the NHS or blah blah blah. If only the NHS were that sophisticated. But there's all that stuff. So there is a demand there, and increasingly with generations coming up, they just expect all that to be available. But if you frame that question as, do you want government to give your authentication details to 20 different organisations, people will say no. But if you said, do you want to be able to access through a single point, whatever, they would say yes. So you have to kind of have, there has to be an informed debate about what the risk is with the public. And I don't know, people are really up for that, because they just want it to work, don't they? It's like people want their club card with Tesco to give them vouchers for the things they buy. That's all algorithm, their data being used and they're consented to, but people really like that. So it does kind of depend on, I think, how you frame the...
You just need to hope that the system works. If you're a TSB
I was just thinking about TSB,
really
absolutely. What worries me, and I'm sure the sense this is the first thing my husband tells me to shut up about it, but is if there's a massive power cut, or Putin pulls out the power or whatever, everything we have is electronic now. All banking, all 90-something% of money doesn't exist. So how does that work? If but he doesn't say stop thinking about it. There's nothing we can do about that.
We've only got a couple of minutes left for the feedback session, so maybe it would be worth just taking a few minutes to think about, as we said that this session might inform the agenda, going forward. So maybe it's worth having a little think about if there's anything that's come up, either in this session or the last session, that you think we should think about for the policy committee, or meetings, or like we did the gender workshop, and so I'd be open to considering if something's come up that people think maybe we should do a workshop on that as well. If anything, I'll be quiet now to let people actually do the decisions.
Would it be useful to do something on millennials?
Yeah, well, it was one of the things that I mentioned through there was what impacts the demographics going of at that time, because we'll probably be coming to the tail end of the baby boomers being alive. So what kind of services is going to be available at that time? What kind of education? Because most of our organisations deal with the aftermath, the impact of certain conditions. So how do we go about being more preventative about that? Are people going to be living even longer then?
Where are the spaces where these kind of issues, the longer term stuff, is seriously discussed in Scotland? Are there any spaces where it is seriously discussed? I mean, like, for example, let's take Leaders Forum.
Leaders Forum,
do
yeah.
they discuss these kind of issues? And
Yeah. There's lots of there. I've been quite a kind of key player in Scottish Leaders Forum, and they talk about lots of stuff.
but nothing.
So it is, and it's really hard because there's it's hundreds of people, and everyone's really engaged and talks, or some people just never engage with it. To be fair, but the people who turn up engage, but it's really hard to then sustain anything afterwards, even though everyone the motivation is there. You then go back to running a local authority, running a public body, running a public sector organisation, whatever, and you have to set your budget and do that stuff. So it's quite hard, but the conversations are all on that kind of stuff. Yeah, absolutely. And it's been all about inequality. It's been about participative democracy, that kind of stuff. But it's talk.
Okay.
It's good talk. But
It's good talk.
Yeah. So I'm on a group that's looking at how we can change that.
Okay.
I think people tend to be quite reluctant to discuss that sort of far ahead with that type of thing, just because things are so tragically changeable. As well, you could have done this sort of thing even saying sort of 5 years ago, going down to the future, and then Brexit's just sort of changed everything, or there's an event or something comes up which just massively changes this. People think are possibly just a bit reluctant to do anything extensive on it because of the potential for change.
There's all this stuff like citizen participation and there's little groups, I think, of pockets of people that do things around and Commonwealth, people like that do stuff, but there's not a big global nation wide thing. Not prone to exaggeration ever at all. But we could do something like that, couldn't we? We could have a digital platform or a virtual something. If we want it, that's the thing.
Okay to feedback from the conversations here, or just Rochelle feedback? Rochelle, you're okay to feedback the conversations?
Yeah, I can maybe do a double act because I got Nepal.
Yeah.
So hiya, Chacharia. Are you managing to connect or? Oh. Well, what I've done is I've created a Zoom meeting.
We'll just do Michelle, like 5 minutes from each group.
I've got it.
And then I get
used
10
just
minutes
now,
to
so you won't be.
have conversation.
Won't be able to hear you.
Like,
Alright.
here's the lead off
Kick
and
off
I'll
and
lead
then-
in for anything that.
So maybe in the next 3 or 4 minutes. We're going to do a feedback first. I'll take about 10 minutes.
Yeah,
Just disconnect now and you'll be connected. Yeah.
Upstairs, yeah, the
Just
pass is on the
connected.
chair.
Stay on the line.
Right, so you just go
3
straight
days of
upstairs
holidays, so
and
we've
the
been
doors
talking
on
about
And
the
then when it's
on
ready,
the
I'll just message
grey
you.
chair.
Or I could just record. You'll be muted until that point anyways.
yeah.
Okay.
We all thought it was going to be kind of Jim Roon's like he's sobered up and calmed down a little bit. We've been some
he's visiting in July.
Got you. Yeah, you're in.
I'll be on the back.
Yeah, excellent. Okay,
Did you see?
that's you in.
That's why there was a call about
Yes, I
national.
can see you. Yeah, I can see you and hear you. But I've got you muted at the moment. I'll unmute you when it's time. But I'll keep your video on as well. Okay. Thank you.
Shelley, have you got all the emails from those week about all future stuff? So you sent the ones from Wales, Northern Ireland, the papers, Northern Ireland.
I think I've got all of them.
They never do.
If there's any missing, I'll get back to
There
you.
was the one from the academic for the meeting that we all sent. Was the ones that Nick was sent one, and then the guys we all sent some links to some of their reports and stuff.
I've
Double check.
written the actions.
I've got. I mean, I can show you the ones just to double check.
Okay.
All I've done is just publicise it.
Probably you've published all the ones, yeah.
Just like a conservative.
I love the fact that we're taking back control.
Yes, yeah.
You do what the people he's putting the two between us and the structure. Be careful not elected.
I didn't realise it was here. I didn't realise it was
in the
here.
rain.
She's not, she's on.
Well, I just sat in Costa.
Oh, right,
and
okay.
she was
Still
sorry,
with us virtually.
and then
Alright.
She's
I
here.
was halfway across town when it started. I was just like,
It just waited till there was no.
She didn't realise.
There he is.
She got mixed. She
I just
didn't
came
realise.
out of the train station and
Oh, nice.
started raining.
Okay.
Duck in.
So,
Okay.
he was hiding under some scaffolding.
Traffic,
for
traffic,
5
traffic,
minutes.
yeah.
You're just as bad as the Brexiteers were worried about passports.
I want my
It's because of blue, that's when we went to France. I did like the article on the BBC about how the company who makes them isn't going to sue the government for them being made in procurement. Just waiting on your mother.
No, Brad, so you call it Darren. So I wish that was it.
Call it Gary, because Gary's going extinct. Yeah. Apparently, nobody's calling children Gary.
I just like the fact that they're desperate to put the ginger one away from road. They're pumping yet another one to block.
Should I apologise to any gingers who may be watching?
Oh, don't you, because it's proper discrimination.
It's not proper.
I mean, given one birth to them, that is always discriminated against.
So we've got about 15 minutes for feedback. So I think Ruchir and Shelley are going to double act from group 2, and Ruth with her marvellous mind map is going to
Shelley's very good.
feedback. So I think if we can kind of keep it to like 5 minutes from each group, then it gives us 5-10 minutes to feed any final thoughts in, and then we can take all that away and have a think about it. So will we go with Ruth's
Yeah.
mind map?
Might not be so good as I try and navigate it, but we'll give it a go. So one of the first things we talked about was the public. So we were wondering if the public actually understand the third sector. There's still quite a lot of misunderstandings about what a sector is, whether we should be paid to work in the sector. And in the second group, we built on that and said we probably have an option of whether we redefine ourselves or educate people about what we actually are. We talked about what people expect from us as a sector. So with things like campaigning, Benoxam did the rich list, there's a little bit of pushback from that in terms of whether that's actually something we should be doing. So do we want to have those difficult conversations and say, well actually yeah, we do think this is something we should be doing because it meets our charitable ambitions? Or do we want to kind of push back from that and instead focus on what the public actually want us to be doing? But maybe we don't actually know what that is yet. David also made the point that probably the way we operate at the moment satisfies the needs of the baby boomer generation, but maybe the generations that come after that would want us to work in a slightly different way. So with things like March for Our Lives, they've taken a slightly different approach from what we maybe would have taken in the past. So we need to think about maybe doing a little bit of guesswork about what future generations are going to look like. And maybe they won't need us at all because we raised the point that they're all getting healthy eating shoved down their throat early. They're talking about the Sustainable Development Goals already. So maybe there'll be no need for us in the future, we don't know. The other thing we talked about was the way that the sector operates. So maybe the organisations are a bit too rigid, we're a bit too territorial about our causes, thinking that this is an issue for us only, rather than trying to work across with other organisations as well. That means that we're quite rigid in terms. I want to raise the point, for example, that cancer research are interested in prevention, but maybe that's in a certain part of the prevention spectrum, and we're quite siloed rather than thinking about how we can kind of build a group of people that are interested in prevention for different ways, but trying to promote that to the government, that it's actually the prevention part that's important. We also talked about the political side of things. So the point was raised that we shouldn't let others define who we are. And a bad example of that was with the big society, which really fed into a lot of the problems we see now with people not thinking that the organisations in the sector should be paid to do that work, because it was seen as being built on kind of voluntary action. We also talked about whether we should be focusing on political outcomes and government outcomes that are set by government, or whether it should be about us setting our own outcomes. And when those things kind of overlap or cross over, is it okay for us to start thinking about what we want to achieve for the government, or is it a separate thing altogether? We said as well, on a very positive note, Emily was the positive one, and said that by 2050 some of our causes might actually be solved, and there's no need for organisations to exist if their causes have been solved. So how do we want the sector to be flexible and be able to adapt to the society that we're working in? The main thing that kind of thread through all of this was about the sector's values. And if we have kind of a return to values, what does that mean for our identity as a sector? What do we see as being our role for society? What do we think makes us a valuable part of that society? And where do we see us as being placed in society? And I think there's maybe a little bit about us understanding that first before we can go back to that public part and communicate that to the public as a message as well. We thought that maybe we need to have a return to stories, and if we kind of link our values to stories and be able to tell people about what we're doing, maybe that's how we get people on side. That's also a way for us to keep it really simple and communicate to people that are maybe a little bit cynical about charities, because we're able to say we're working towards a society that looks like X, society in that way. The political part should become a bit less important because any government will fund us if we're able to prove what we're doing, and also be able to defend us as a sector because they'll see the value for themselves in terms of what we're doing. Finally, I think the bit about values and stories was about also moving away from the use of data to highlight our successes. So that's obviously always going to be an important part, but maybe it's those kind of the narratives that sit around that that's very important as well. And the final point on values, if I use my 5 minutes, am I okay for one more point?
Keep going.
The final point on values was whether we can actually say that as a sector charities have a shared value anymore, or whether that's quite specific to individual organisations. And from that, whether charity is actually the right word anymore, or whether the model's kind of changed beyond charities, where that kind of feeds into the public's misconceptions because we're still focusing on the word charity. There was some chat about in America, for example, they kind of moved away from that language and it's all about not-for-profits or NGOs, also thinking about kind of responsible business and the way that they operate as well, and maybe we're a bit resistant to that because we want to kind of defend our patch as charities, but maybe it's about us being a little bit more flexible with that as well, and whether charity still has connotations about the poor law and doing things for people and people standing outside churches, and whether it's more about now us working with people rather than for them. So how do we kind of communicate that idea of a modern charity to the public as well? So yeah, mostly focused on how the sector operates, how we can collaborate, the political landscape, our values, and how we communicate that to the public.
Sounds good. All of that was shared.
Wow, that's amazing actually. And actually quite distinct conversation as well in some respects, because we didn't focus so much on values as I think you did. We touched on it, but not in the same way. I suppose that was about linking together economy and technology, and the conversation that we had. I mean, we started by looking at the interaction between different agendas that traditionally are siloed, and looking at what kind of things bind them together. So the sustainable development goals, systems approaches, more holistic approaches, and that'll focus on sustainable development goals would be quite useful. The economy, the conversation's already starting to change about what the economy is for and how it's constituted and what it means. And we're seeing more conversations linking this to resilience and quality of life now, so that's something to build on. Of course we touched on preventative spend and the advocacy that's coming quite largely from our sector about taking a longer term view, but also now filtering through the public sector and other areas. And also how things go in cycles, so that by 2030 there's a danger we might just end up back in the same starting point where we started off, as people kind of, as fads emerge and grow and so on. How do we make some of these new ways of thinking and the approaches, like for example on the economy, part of the norm and not just a cyclical thing? How do we as a sector get better at thinking about how we engage with government and the money that comes from government for sector causes and so on, and from donors of course as well. We started to look at some particular examples, like for example how if you want to tackle heart disease you need to look at housing and so on. So at the moment we don't kind of make those connections as well as we should be. And I think a lot of that for us then led to leadership of charities being important, and and leaders being able to like not just look out for their own territory, but also kind of see how they can achieve the causes they're trying to get encouraged to their organisations by working with others. Lots of stuff here about ownership of shared goals, mindset changes, and looking more broadly at the kind of solutions that we want. And this, of course, led us to thinking about public awareness of charities and need to make the case for charity. And in the wake of the Oxfam scandal, just like you had mentioned, that it's important now that we have a very strong message to explain what we've done. And we talked about the 2020 project that SCVO is leading on, third sector influence on campaigns, which has been quite substantial over the last 20 years, but we need to articulate that. We also looked at the changing trends in giving and the mechanics of fundraising and how, the way in which people give and who gives and how they give changes is already starting to change enormously. But I think in all of that, we start to recognise that maybe we sometimes get too fixated of the charity approach. And actually a lot of people, including young millennials and others, are using other models now to try and achieve social change. The word B Corps was mentioned, the movement around so much more socially minded business enterprises, and that movement is growing quite rapidly. And I think all of this kind of led back to, well, what is it when people are trying to achieve social change and build trust? And I think we start to look a bit at openness and transparency in an era of fake news. People no longer will just listen to a message. Let's say we do the 2020 message. Will people just accept at face value that charities are brilliant because they say they are? Probably not. So we need to think about how we open up ourselves a bit more so that people can find out for themselves what it is that charities can achieve and so on. Big conversation about migration, what our workforce will look like, distinction between baby boomers and millennials, which I think you already touched on, so the same kind of discussion there. Also focusing on that millennials are less likely, because of austerity and the squeeze on wages, to give than maybe the baby boomer generation. And we need to think about what implications that will have for giving for the sector. Where are the spaces where we convene opportunities to look ahead? We discussed the Leaders Forum, and Anna mentioned that she's been involved in looking at how the Leaders Forum could evolve. Charity shops and the value of volunteering. Noticing that we often talk about older folk, the increase in life expectancy of people as a burden, but actually there's a huge benefit in terms of volunteering and contribution to society. Also noticing that in charity shops, it tends to be either retirees or people who've come to the country from Europe as before they get into the employment system and so on. So we need to think about some of the dynamics there. We also looked at technology and how technology can change the way in which we work as a sector. And we looked at rural volunteers and how they can actually be on helplines. Why does the helpline need to be situated in the centre of a city, for example? And thinking globally, how can it change our day job, not just our message? We also looked at the changing ways in which organisations are trying to organise the way in which they structure their management. So Cornerstone was an example that came up in the self-management teams that they have, and what the advantages of that, the new ways of thinking, and so on, but also some of the challenges around those new ways of managing, the cynicism that might come off the back of it, where people think, is it just a cheap way of delivery and so on. So we need to kind of think through all these issues a bit more carefully. And then the second group, I'm not.
Yeah, I think I've only got probably a few things to add. In the second group, we talked a lot about how technology isn't neutral and how that's something that we should be really aware of. Someone makes choices about how it's programmed. One example was that face recognition software doesn't work as well for people of colour. We talked as well about the bots that different organisations have been using to communicate things with their beneficiaries, or question and answer type bots. And we raised how people said they preferred them because they didn't feel judged, and then Mona raised that it's an issue that they feel judged if they have those same things with a person. So although it's good that people like the bots, it highlights another issue that's there. We talked about how with Brexit, Owen talked about a course that he had been on relating to and governance for e-health. And he said that the UK could end up in a really difficult position if we don't have stringent privacy laws, as we may become deemed unsafe for sharing information from other countries, and how that could be a big issue for us. I think one of the main things that came out of our conversation quite towards the end, which Owen mentioned again, is are we reluctant to think about the long term because of the potential for change in the short term? And Brexit was mentioned as an example, and does that limit our willingness to think long term when we're always so aware that things might change? So I think that would be something useful to reflect on. And as a final point, we were thinking about future agendas, and one issue that was raised, similar to what Ruth has said, is the impact of age demographics. And with that impact, should we start to think about the sort of services that people might need, and is there something to be done around that? We also tried to think about future thinking more generally, and where there was other spaces to think about future thinking, and I think we didn't really come up with too much examples, so something to reflect on. Common Wheel was mentioned, so I don't know, something to reflect on who maybe could come to the committee in the future to talk about future thinking.
Sounds good. We've got about 4 minutes. If anyone wants to pick up on anything or throw anything that wasn't mentioned, I think what would be good after today is to kind of take that away and kind of try and summarise it, and then we can potentially get it up on Basecamp, but obviously there's a large portion of the committee's not here, so it'd be good to get them to weigh in on that discussion as well. And I think there's certainly a number of big themes. I mean, demographics is one, values is another one. I think there's some more stuff around economy, taxation, all that sort of stuff that we could potentially be looking at agenda points where we could invite 2 or 3 external organisations who are working in that area or have input to help us kind of think our way forward in some of this stuff. So if anyone's got anything pressing right now.
David, I think once people see the stuff that Shelley's putting up on the wiki, you'll see the different papers, and I think that might spark some other big issues that people don't see. I think that one is one that, you know, would be worth, and it'll help maybe shape a different agenda. We'll circulate the notes from Dublin as well. There's a 1-pager on just some of the discussions. Probably not being much sense you weren't there, but you know, it'll spark a few thoughts.
Yeah, I think that'd be helpful. We good? Perfect. So agenda number 6 is the war on charities. That's probably my language that was written in there. Sector stats in 2020, and I think Ilsa's joining us from Mansfield Trachea. Yeah. This will be future policy committee meetings. We'll all just be in front of an iPad chatting to each other.
Hiya, can you hear me also?
Yeah, I can hear you, Chair.
I'm just going to put you next to the...
Oh, there she is. Hi, Ilsa.
Hello there, I can't see anyone, but I can see the ceiling. Yeah, sorry not to be there in person. So I'm going to give a quick overview of the trust stats that we had that were launched at the gathering. Just a recap on that, and the I Love Charities work that we're doing. So just to give a bit of context, we did a piece of research in 2015 to inform our fundraising and fundraising regulation work. And we wanted to do a bit of work with the public, and it was not just to look at people as donors, it was actually to look at charity trust as well, good practice, transparency, and some other issues. So we commissioned Ipsos Mori, who then did telephone interviews with over 1,000 people from all age ranges and different backgrounds. We then decided to recommission that work in 2017 because there had been a few negative media stories, but it was actually before any of the Oxfam stuff had hit. So you might remember at the gathering we launched the findings, but it was a bit overshadowed with all the issues around international fundraising and some of the bad news stories that went with that. So just to
start off, there was actually some good news that came out, which was a bit overshadowed. So the good news was that 77% of the people we spoke to believe that charities play an important role in their communities. 82% of Scottish households had used a charity in the previous year, so that was all sorts of things from being helped by a charity to just attending sports clubs or going to a community centre. And for the charities that people connected with, really high numbers, 3/4 of people gave them high scores. So we asked them how much do you trust charities on a scale of 1 to 10, 3/4 of people gave scores of 6 out of 10 and higher. And that was no significant change on the 2015 figures. And then comes the big, but. So although Scotland was high for trust and there wasn't much drop in personal trust, when we asked the initial question, just off the top of their heads, the very first question we asked was, how much do you trust charities on a scale of 1 to 10? And the numbers giving scores of 6 out of 10 and higher dropped from 67% to 57%. And we also then later asked a question about, do you agree or disagree that most charities are trustworthy and act in the public interest? 2015, 82%, a massive number, agreed with that. But that fell to 73%, which is still high, but there's something happening. There's been a 10% point drop since we asked in 2015, and that's before any of the big stories hit the headlines. So we also asked whether their trust had gone up or down, and 32% of respondents said their trust had decreased in the last year, and that's gone up from previous. And it's also risen for young people in particular. 41% said that their trust had decreased, so something was definitely going on there. We then asked 2 questions in terms of impact. We just looked at negative media and negative personal experience. So negative media, interestingly, had gone down a little bit. The number of people saying that negative media had influenced them negatively, 38% said that was the case. So it's really high, but it's not as high as it was in 2015. That was 41% of people said negative media had influenced them. But we see in certain age groups that's particularly influential. So 45% of the over 55s and 40% of under 25s said that negative media had an impact on their trust in charities. So it's pretty significant. Personal experience, that wasn't very high in 2015. It was only 15%. I mean, it's still probably pretty important for us as a sector to think, okay, negative media stories is one thing, personal experience is pretty powerful. So 15% in 2015 had said that personal experience had made them lose trust in charities, and that had risen to 21% when we asked in 2017. So it's not massive, but it's still shown a slight negative trend there. And what's particularly concerning is that for young people that had risen from 10% to 21%. And for the over 55s, there's a very high proportion, almost a third, that said that personal experience had a negative impact. So, taken together, it's particularly those sort of factors that might be influencing people's trust in charities led the comms team to develop the I Love Charities campaign. So, I don't know if you're aware of that. So the idea with the I Love Charities campaign was to support good governance, to ensure that charities are well run and are transparent, but also so that we work together and help promote what we do, the positive impact of our work. We've also started, John can also fill it, John's there, but we also did a bit of work with young people in particular, because what we noticed with young people was that they've been the sort of highest trusting group overall, and they're still quite high, but there's been some massive swings in trust due to negative media and a little bit of personal experience. So we had a round table on Tuesday to try and explore with some young people's groups what we might be able to do, what might the issues be. So we're definitely going to try and move forward and maybe have some focus groups with young people to find out what exactly do they mean, what exactly is sitting under those stats with negative media. Is it social media? What is it that they're picking up on? What stories are they hearing, and are there maybe positive stories that they'd like to hear from us? Maybe things around values of charities, or maybe are we communicating how big the charity sector is, what's all sitting under that heading, and what are the values that we all hold, and what values are important to young people, how can we connect maybe? Maybe are there resources, are there case studies we can share? I don't know if you can see this, we did a sort of working, you see that the working with young people, working and volunteering in the sector, so we try and get young people to see the sector as an interesting place to work and to volunteer and to join boards and sort of the whole richness of the sector, trying to convey that in a way that's not incredibly Untitled Charities have always scored low on trust, so I think they're doing a bit of work on the general public and their understanding of international charities. So I think they think it's just massive organisations, and actually there's lots of small ones doing work locally abroad. And also we've obviously got Oscar do a public trust survey, and their results are going to be coming out soon, and they were doing their interviews while all the Oxfam news and various other international bodies were in the news, so it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. But obviously we need to sort of look at what people are saying and sort of look at how much is just knee-jerk reaction, how much is actual sort of valid concerns, and how do we address those, and what more research is needed, if anything. So I think that's my very quick overview, but obviously if you've got any questions.
So any questions for Ilse?
That's really helpful, thank you.
The main trust briefing's on the website. The one they also did this week for the young people, we haven't published yet, but we're happy circulated because it just kind of flagged up to some interesting stuff.
I think it's really...
Sorry, David.
No,
One question did occur to me. Do we know how those results compare with results in other European countries or the States, for example? Has anybody done?
Or
I
even
know the
the rest of
sector
the
is
UK.
different in different, or even the rest of the UK.
I'll second.
Yeah, I mean, we've looked at some trust figures. There's not the same sort of into charities, but there's general sort of look. There's research that looks at trust overall, and I think as a population, the world's population is becoming more cynical and less trusting. And I don't know whether that's because we've got more access to more types of media. So there does seem to be a certain sort of downward trend in terms of trusting institutions. We've only compared our figures against the Charity Commission. So what we see down south is basically that trust has gone down as well, but Scotland's still sitting a bit higher than the other nations, and even just some other council areas in down south as well. So we've not looked at like NGOs in other countries.
Well, one of the main reasons for the question actually is I think I have picked up on some of the headlines about trust, obviously generally being a downward trend across the UK. I was just wondering if anywhere is bucking that trend. Is there anywhere where they've seen an upward trajectory that we could learn from?
There's a big US organisation that does a kind of world trust survey in institutions, the private sector, the public sector, government and all that. And I think for the first time in 12 years, trust in NGOs is even thing that fell. And so I'll get you the details, but Joe's I used it in figures in the blog, because actually general overall people's trust in politics and government, maybe no surprise given the agenda over the last few years with Brexit and Trump and all that, so you could put lots of factors.
People don't trust experts anymore, they don't trust facts anymore.
So there was all of that stuff. I think all of that stuff is they do quite detailed stuff. They've got the headlines, but they look at it's trying to remember what the index is called. The organiser, I'll come back to me and I'll send you the details.
So I think it's
transparency.
No, it's a private sector company, but they've been doing it for a long time, so they've got real trends.
I think it's an interesting, just from the conversation we had before around future trends, what's happening. It's quite interesting to couch into some of the figures that ELSA's, and is SCVO plan to run the sort of next year again? Or?
Well, I think what we're trying to do is we're traditionally on every 2 years, but I think because we're doing the annual charity campaign this year, it might be interesting to do it just before the gathering again next year. The only problem with doing the episodes more is it does take quite a long time because of that there. So we're looking at other options for doing the evaluation. There is another potential option that could be a much quicker way of doing it for us, but we need to look at that and check the costs out. But it'd be good to do it again before that, just to see.
I think from my perspective, I thought it was really good that SCVO still released the figures, even though it was right in the middle of the Oxfam issue, and that it essentially gave the Scotsman a front page to bash Oxfam again. I think it would have been easy for us as a sector to say there's been a small drop here, a small drop there, let's just hold it off. But I think it was really, in terms of open and transparent, there's no point hiding figures if we've got them, and I think it's a good thing for the sector to be doing that.
There was an internal debate, because actually they also will say the underlying figures are actually all very positive
Yeah.
for the sector, all very good, but actually the headline had been a drop, so there was an interesting internal debate about how we position it, and we saw it as you've got to go with the fact that there was a drop. You can, it's great, the underlying stuff, so, but we've got to be open, and I think that's the other thing in terms of the future stuff is, unprecedented era of transparency is upon us and will continue to be on this. The public expect us to be much more transparent. Everybody, not just us.
Yeah. Sounds good. Any other questions for Ilsa? Taz? Thank you, Ilsa.
Thank you. Sorry not to be late.
No problem, we'll catch you later.
Bye.
Bye. So we're 5 minutes behind, so I'm not sticking to my promise here. So I think, are you updating on the 20?
Yeah, I think this will take about 1 minute, so
Oh, well, I'm counting.
it will be very short. So the 2020 campaign, Jenny is leading on that. I think some people in the room are already familiar with it, but I'll just update on what it is. So the campaign will celebrate the positive changes the third sector have made in the 20 years of the Scottish Parliament. It will be launched at the gathering in 2019, and as most of you have probably seen, SCVO have sought examples via Basecamp asking about positive engagement. It will try and cover a range of years and a range of different policy years within the 20-year period, for maybe not one a year, depending on what we get in. The aim is to highlight the positive changes the sector have influenced, to remind MSPs of positive impact on work with the sector, and help encourage public trust, like we've just been speaking about. It's also to give charities confidence in talking positively about campaigning work and spending money on campaigning, as it does achieve charitable aims. A couple of examples that have been raised already: smoke and ban, right to know, equal marriage. But the main thing to say is that the deadline is the 30th of April. So if you can think of something that the sector did achieve during the 20 years of the Scottish Parliament and you'd like to put it forward as part of an example, it doesn't have to be your own organisation, any example that you think, yes, is something we should highlight, then email Jenny by the 30th. And I understand there's going to be a small judging panel, which will include Jenny, David, our policy committee chair, and Susan Lowes from Mary Curie, who sat on the lobbying working group for the lobbying register. And that's all.
We're not judging until the end of May, so if you're a little bit late, we'll let you. But I think
Tell Jenny.
yeah, Jenny's watching, sorry. But yeah, and I think just to add on that, we're not looking for full details at this time on it, so just a top line, here's what was done or here's what achieved. And like Shelley said, there's loads of people being messaging about campaigns that weren't in an organisation or they weren't involved in, but just remember that it was a big thing in the Parliament or achieved a big change, so do fire them in. I suspect next year there'll be a lot of razzmatazz around 20 years of the Scottish Parliament, and I think it'd be a bit weird for us not to be making as much noise, given all the things that have occurred in those 20 years. And yeah, looking for a full breadth of campaigns, because there has been, from smoke and ban to equal marriage to some environmental legislation has been passed, so yeah, as much of the sector as possible would be great.
I think there's really a lot of competition. I think she's had a lot already, so although you might think it's okay to relate, I'm not sure.
We might used to have to expand that.
Have we had more than 20?
Oh, I don't think so. Then we can't call it 20 and 20.
Yeah.
No, have we had more submissions?
She didn't say how many she'd had, but she said she'd had a lot. So,
Yeah.
Must be. I sent 11, and so there
Oh,
must
yeah.
be. I just sent a list. Like,
You're just hedging your bet.
yeah, no, not from the BHF. I mean, like from like things I remember from the sector. Yeah, just a lot of BHF things. I've not been that busy. So yeah, so do get involved. I think it'd be a really good. I think it'd be a really positive campaign to talk about all that. So we've got a minute left for AOCB. Anyone got anything like to raise? Anything from today's meeting for future meetings? So this is why you put AOCB before lunch. Nobody speaks up. Stephen's smart in this way. Well, yeah, we can close the meeting. So I think
I noticed the next meeting is on the 26th of September. We've rearranged our Scottish Parliament reception for that evening. So I don't know what people think about it, you might want to say change the time meeting between
Yeah, we might make it
two
two
to
to
four
four.
so people then. And if we do that, right now, we can send you a link because I think we had 160 signed up and so send an invitation out again, another 80 will signed up, so
Yeah.
people
No, I think-
we'll send the registration link so we can go straight to the reception and
And I think that's better for guys from Glasgow as well, if they're through for that, and they can stay on for the reception if they
yeah,
want
yeah,
to.
that's
So,
it.
yeah, we can pick that up ahead of the next one. So yeah, thank you for coming. Hopefully that was interesting. It got people thinking. I'll be in touch over the summer. It's quite a while till the next meeting, so I think there's a chance for